Poor girl sits wrong table on blind date. Never thought he's millionaire and falls love with her. Elena Rossi is a passionate art student currently studying at the Florence Academy of Art, a place she has always dreamed of attending. Born and raised in a middle-class family in New York, Elena displayed a talent for painting and a deep love for art from an early age. Despite receiving a partial scholarship, Elena struggles to make ends meet while living abroad. She works part-time at a small cafe and paints on the streets of Florence to earn enough to pay for her tuition. Some nights she stays up late sketching in her cramped room, with the only light coming from an old desk lamp. Difficulties never discourage Elena. For her, every brushstroke is a step closer to her dream of becoming a professional artist. No matter the challenges, Elena perseveres, driven by passion, even though the road ahead remains uncertain and full of obstacles. That day, as the sun dipped behind the ancient rooftops of Florence, Elena received a message from her best friend, Sophia, a lively local with a spirited personality. Sophia excitedly invited her to a blind date she had arranged through an app. "Elena, you need to take a break and meet someone. Florence isn't just about books and paintbrushes." Sophia laughed, pushing Elena out of the cafe where she worked. Under the pressure of her friend, Elena reluctantly agreed. Wearing a simple pastel dress and her worn-out shoes, Elena entered Il Giardino, an upscale restaurant she often passed by but never dared to enter. The atmosphere was warm, with golden lights reflecting off neatly arranged bottles of wine. Elena carefully looked around but saw no one resembling Sophia's description. At a table by the window, flickering candlelight caught her eye. Hesitant, she sat down, assuming she was the first to arrive. 10 minutes later, a man with wavy brown hair and deep blue eyes, reminiscent of Florence's night sky, approached. He appeared puzzled to see her. "Excuse me, who are you?" he asked, his gaze briefly shifting to the chair across from Elena. Blushing, Elena realized she might have sat at the wrong table. "Oh, I think I'm mistaken. I'm sorry, I'll leave right away," she said, flustered as she stood to leave. But Luca raised his hand to stop her. "It's all right. Since you're already here, why not stay for a while?" He smiled warmly. "I'm waiting for a friend, but he's always late. Maybe a little conversation will make the time pass faster." Elena hesitated for a moment, but Luca's sincerity convinced her to stay. "Well, I suppose I can wait with you." She smiled, telling herself it was just a casual conversation. After a few exchanges, Luca suddenly asked, "Your accent sounds familiar. Where are you from?" "I'm from New York," Elena replied softly. Luca laughed. "What a coincidence. So am I. I didn't expect to meet a fellow New Yorker in the heart of Florence." Elena chuckled and nodded. "I'm an art student here at the Florence Academy. I'm in my final year, still struggling with tuition and part-time jobs." Luca squinted slightly, stirring his glass of wine. "So you're working and studying at the same time? Florence seems like a perfect place to pursue art." Elena nodded. "It is, but sometimes it's tough, especially when I have to work every night to cover expenses. What about you?" Luca leaned back, smiling gently. "I'm just a tourist, a 1-month getaway to escape work back in New York." Elena widened her eyes and laughed. "We're both from New York, but met here in Florence. It really is a small world." Luca's eyes glimmered with interest. "Indeed, but perhaps that's the charm of Florence, a city of art and unexpected encounters." The surprise and the sense of familiarity between them made the atmosphere more comfortable. Their conversation flowed naturally and lasted longer than expected. Elena was drawn to Luca's humor and sincerity, while Luca found it refreshing to meet someone unaware of his status. "I love how Florence makes people feel like they're living in a painting," Elena said, gazing out at the square. Luca smiled, gently swirling his glass. "I think so too, but I'm not much of a painter. Maybe you could teach me a few things." Elena laughed. "I'm afraid a student like you might give up too soon." The evening passed with laughter and lighthearted stories. When Luca's friend finally arrived, Elena stayed, and they had dinner together. At the end of the evening, Luca suggested, "I'm planning to visit the Uffizi Gallery tomorrow. Would you like to join me?" Elena was surprised but agreed, thinking it might be a fun way to explore Florence again, this time with a new friend. Little did she know That mistaken evening was merely the beginning of a much larger story, one neither she nor Luca could have foreseen. After their chance meeting at the restaurant, Luca and Elena quickly grew close. Florence, the city of art and love, seemed to have become an invisible bridge between them. In the days that followed, Luca often visited the cafe where Elena worked. Each time he sat by the window, ordered an espresso, and opened a book, but his eyes were always drawn to Elena. "You again?" Elena teased when she saw Luca for the third time that week. "Florence is beautiful, but I think this cafe is even more so." Luca shrugged, his eyes gleaming with mischief. In the late afternoons, they strolled along the banks of the Arno River, where the golden hues of the sunset painted the water, reflecting the ancient beauty of the city. Luca constantly asked about Elena's paintings, while she eagerly shared stories about the hidden corners of Florence that she loved most. One evening, Luca invited Elena to the Uffizi Gallery, home to masterpieces from the Renaissance. Initially, Elena declined, mentioning the expensive entrance fee, but Luca gently placed 2 tickets in front of her. "You didn't have to do that," Elena said, her voice tinged with hesitation. "I just want to learn more about art," Luca joked. Throughout the visit, Luca stayed by Elena's side, listening intently as she explained each painting and sculpture. He realized that Elena's world was vastly different from his own, full of color, passion, and creativity, in stark contrast to the long meetings and billion-dollar deals that filled his life back in New York. "What do you see when you look at this painting?" Luca asked as they stopped in front of Botticelli's Primavera. "I see life," Elena replied, her eyes sparkling. "And you?" "I see you," Luca whispered softly, enough to make Elena blush. Beyond museum visits, they enjoyed gelato together on narrow streets, where Luca opened up about his childhood, shaped by the pressures of living under his father's shadow, a powerful and strict man. Elena listened quietly, occasionally brushing her hand against his, offering silent comfort. "You're not like anyone I've met before," Elena admitted as they sat by the river one evening. "I take that as a good thing," Luca smiled warmly. Despite the joyful moments, they both knew their time in Florence wouldn't last forever. Luca was only in Italy for a month, and the day of his return to the U.S. was approaching. On his last day, they drove to the rolling hills of Tuscany, where vineyards stretched as far as the eye could see beneath the endless blue sky. Sitting beneath an old olive tree, they quietly took in the scenery. "A month goes by so quickly, doesn't it?" Elena sighed softly, her voice laced with regret. "Fast but meaningful," Luca replied, his gaze lingering on her face. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Luca turned to Elena and said, "If it's meant to be, we'll meet again." Elena smiled but said nothing. In that moment, they both understood. Some connections don't need promises, only a little faith in destiny, and their fate, though uncertain, seemed destined to intertwine again someday. After graduating from the Florence Academy of Art, Elena returned to New York with a heart full of ambition, but not without worries. Life in Italy had been challenging, yet it was filled with beautiful memories, especially the days spent with Luca. Back in the city where she was born and raised, Elena began her journey to find opportunities in the art world. In the early days, she worked part-time at a small gallery in Soho, a space often used to showcase exhibitions for newly graduated artists. That afternoon, Elena was busy preparing for her classmate Lila's exhibition, a promising young painter. As Elena stood at the back of the room arranging the frames, a familiar voice echoed from behind her. "I didn't expect to see Florence in New York." Startled, Elena turned around. Standing before her was Luca, his hair still the same soft waves, but now paired with a sleek suit. He stood among the paintings, his eyes filled with both surprise and joy. "Luca?" Elena gasped, unconsciously clutching the cloth she was holding. "What are you doing here?" Luca smiled and stepped closer. "I came at the invitation of a friend, but I didn't expect to see you again." As Elena met Luca's gaze, memories of Florence flooded back. The times they stood beneath the olive trees in Tuscany, sharing stories and vague promises of meeting again in the future. "What a coincidence," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I work here." "I guess the universe arranged it." Luca shrugged, his eyes still fixed on Elena. When the exhibition ended, Luca didn't leave right away. They stayed behind in the gallery after the guests had departed, the soft golden light gently draped over them. "When did you return to New York?" Luca asked, stirring the coffee Elena had just made for him. "About 3 months ago. I'm still searching for bigger opportunities, but starting at this small gallery isn't too bad." Luca nodded. "You've always been passionate about art. I'm not surprised. And you?" Elena tilted her head, curious. "Still the busy businessman?" Luca smiled. "Perhaps, but now I have one more reason to stay in New York longer." Their conversation flowed naturally, as if no time or distance had separated them. Luca offered to walk Elena home after the exhibition, and as they stood at her doorstep, Luca hesitated. "Would you like to grab coffee tomorrow?" Elena paused for a moment but eventually nodded. "I think Florence isn't just in Italy." From that point on, they saw each other more often. Mornings over cups of coffee, late afternoons strolling through Central Park, and long evenings gazing at paintings in various galleries. Their feelings deepened over time. One evening, as Luca and Elena sat on a bench in the park, Luca gently took her hand. "Elena, do you think we're heading towards something serious?" Elena met his eyes, already knowing the answer. "I think we are." At that moment, the invisible thread connecting them from Florence to New York seemed to tighten more than ever. Do you think their love story is beautiful? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more love stories you won't want to miss. As Elena and Luca's relationship deepened, Luca decided it was time to introduce Elena to his family in New York. Despite feeling nervous and out of place in Luca's lavish world, Elena tried to remain composed. The meeting took place at the Thompsons' luxurious estate in the suburbs of New York, a grand mansion reflecting the family's wealth and power in the financial world. From the moment Elena stepped into the marble-floored living room, she felt the piercing gaze of Richard Thompson, Luca's father. After dinner, Richard called Luca into his study, leaving Elena with his mother, Margaret Thompson. "Are you serious about this girl, Luca?" Richard's voice was low and cold. Luca met his father's gaze without flinching. "Yes, father, I love her." Richard narrowed his eyes, setting his glass of wine down on the oak desk. "She's not suitable for you. You're the heir to the Thompson empire. You need someone of equal standing." In the living room, Margaret smiled kindly at Elena, but her words carried an unmistakable message. "Elena, you seem like a lovely girl, but do you think your family background aligns with Luca's? Our family values tradition and reputation." Elena remained silent, her hands unconsciously tightening around the fabric of her dress. After the meeting, Luca sensed something was wrong. Elena's usual warmth had faded into polite but distant smiles. "Is everything all right?" Luca asked as they walked to her apartment. Elena forced a small smile. "I'm fine. I just wonder if your family will ever accept me." Luca took her hands firmly. "I don't care what they think. I love you." However, the family's disapproval wasn't what hurt Elena the most. The real pain came from a truth she stumbled upon weeks later. One afternoon, while arranging paintings for a small exhibition, Elena received a phone call from her uncle, the only relative who still kept in touch after her family's downfall. "Elena, you're dating Luca Thompson, aren't you?" His voice wavered. "Yes." "Why?" Elena replied, her heartbeat quickening. "Did you know his father is the one who destroyed our family's company?" Elena froze, the pencil in her hand slipping to the floor. "What are you talking about? That can't be true." Her uncle sighed heavily. 5 years ago, your father's construction company was a competitor to the Thompson Group. They undercut our contracts and used aggressive tactics to win major projects, leaving us in debt and eventually bankrupt. Painful memories resurfaced. Elena recalled the disappointment in her father's eyes, the day they left their beloved home in the cramped apartment they were forced to move into. That evening, Elena met Luca at their usual cafe, but her gaze lacked the warmth it once held. "Elena, is something wrong?" Luca noticed the shift immediately. Elena bit her lip, her voice trembling. "Did you know your family destroyed mine?" Luca's expression shifted from confusion to shock. "I had no idea." Tears welled up in Elena's eyes. "My father's company collapsed because of your family's ruthless tactics. Your father orchestrated it all." Luca reached for her hand, but she pulled away. "I'm sorry. If I had known, I never would have let things go this far. Luca, I don't know if I can continue this. Elena's voice cracked as she hurried out of the cafe, leaving Luca sitting alone, consumed by guilt and regret. For Elena, love felt fragile against the weight of their family's history. But in Luca's heart, he knew he couldn't lose Elena, the one person who had given his life true meaning. After a tense evening, Luca returned home with a heavy heart. Elena's words echoed relentlessly in his mind. Your family destroyed ours. Luca stepped into the Grand Thompson estate, but for the first time it felt cold and distant. He glanced around, realizing that everything he owned, from his tailored suits to the comfort of his lavish room, was tied to his father's legacy. Richard Thompson sat in his study, a glass of red wine swirling gently in his hand. He looked up as Luca entered. Is everything all right? I assume that girl couldn't quite handle your lifestyle, Richard remarked indifferently, his eyes detached. Luca sat across from his father, his expression resolute. Did you know you destroyed her family? Richard sighed, setting his glass down. Son, that's how business works. Winners and losers. You can't let emotions cloud your judgment. No, Father, this isn't just business. It's someone's life, their family. Richard remained silent for a moment, then shrugged. If you want to pursue her, fine, but you'll have to make a choice. Luca understood his father's ultimatum. He could either hold on to everything or walk away and forge his own path. Without hesitation, Luca stood, his voice unwavering. I choose Elena. The next day, Luca announced his resignation as vice president of Thompson Enterprises, leaving the board in shock. The media buzzed with news of Richard Thompson's only son stepping away from the prestigious company. Starting from scratch, Luca invested his savings into a small firm, focusing on sustainable construction projects and supporting small businesses. A step toward righting the wrongs his family had once committed. The early days were tough. Luca, once the heir to a massive corporation, now faced the struggles of an entrepreneur, endless meetings, tight budgets, and constant pressure. But the thought of Elena kept him going. On a rainy night, Luca stood at Elena's apartment door, drenched but smiling as the door opened. What are you doing here? Elena's eyes held a flicker of coldness. Luca met her gaze. I can't change the past, but I can choose my future. Elena remained silent, yet something in her heart stirred. I left Thompson Enterprises, Luca continued, his voice soft but earnest. I don't want to live a life shaped by my father. I'm building my own path, and I want you to be part of it. The rain kept falling, but the space between them seemed to dissolve. Elena stepped back, leaving the door open. Come in. You'll catch a cold. Her voice was quiet but warm. Luca stepped inside, carrying the hope of a new beginning. In the weeks that followed, Luca and Elena began anew. There was no rush, just two people rebuilding trust, one day at a time. Luca often stopped by the gallery where Elena worked, sometimes bringing coffee or simply admiring her latest paintings. One afternoon, as Elena put the finishing touches on a large canvas, Luca quietly appeared behind her. Have you forgiven me yet? He asked softly. Elena paused, turning to face him. I haven't forgotten, but I think I can learn to forgive. Luca smiled and gently pulled her into his arms. That's all I need. Under the soft glow of the studio lights, they held hands, knowing that while the road ahead might still hold obstacles, they were ready to face it together. A year had passed since Luca left his family's company, and life for both him and Elena had gradually found its rhythm. Luca now owned a small but steadily growing, sustainable construction company, while Elena continued pursuing her art career, preparing for her first solo exhibition in New York. Though challenges remained, they had learned to face them together. Elena no longer kept her distance from Luca, and the trust they had lost was slowly rebuilt. They began to think seriously about the future. On a warm summer afternoon, Luca unexpectedly suggested returning to Florence. We should go back to where it all began, Luca said as they sat by the window of a small cafe overlooking the Arno River. Elena was surprised but couldn't refuse. Florence had always held the most precious memories of their relationship. When they arrived in Florence, the city retained its timeless charm and romantic allure. Elena and Luca strolled along the cobbled streets, savoring gelato just like the old days. In the afternoon, Luca drove Elena to the rolling hills of Tuscany, where rows of olive trees stretched under the soft sunlight. Under the shade of a large olive tree, the very place where they once shared whispered stories and uncertain promises, Luca pulled over. "Let's walk for a bit," Luca gently said, taking Elena's hand and guiding her toward the old tree. As they stood beneath its branches, Elena felt her heart race. The surrounding landscape was peaceful, with only the soft rustle of the wind. Luca turned to Elena, his eyes filled with sincerity and love. Slowly he knelt and pulled out a small, shimmering ring that glinted under the distant sunset. "Elena, I want to build a future with you, not because of my family, but because of us. Will you become a part of my life?" Elena froze, her hand instinctively covering her mouth as tears welled up. She looked into Luca's eyes, the eyes of a man who had given up everything for her, someone willing to start anew, just to be by her side. Tears streamed down her face as she nodded gently. "I will." Her voice trembled with happiness. Luca stood, sliding the ring onto her finger, before wrapping her in his arms. They embraced under the olive tree as the sunset bathed the Tuscan fields in golden light. Following the engagement, they returned to Florence to begin planning for the future. Luca and Elena decided on a small, intimate wedding in the very olive grove where he had proposed. There was no extravagance or grandeur, just simplicity, love, and heartfelt sincerity. On their wedding day, as Elena walked toward Luca, all the pain and struggles of the past faded away. All that remained were two people who had overcome countless obstacles, ready to step forward into a new chapter together. Under the radiant sunset, they exchanged vows, promising to face every challenge and build a life of true happiness together. In Florence, the city that had witnessed their love story continued to stand as a silent testament to the love they vowed to cherish forever. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like and share it with someone who might need a little inspiration. Subscribe